A man convicted of killing his former lover and her husband has been executed. David Hosier died by lethal injection.
A decorated Navy veteran, a tragic love triangle, and a fatal ending that would send shockwaves through Missouri. David Hosier, once a public servant, now became the face of a controversial death penalty case, one that questioned justice, motive, and mental health. In 2009, 2 bodies were discovered in a Jefferson City apartment. Angela Gilpin and her husband Rodney were gunned down, and all signs pointed to David Hosier, her former lover. Over the next 15 years, the story would unravel into one of grief, obsession, and a final plea for mercy. What began as an affair turned into a calculated act of violence. Angela tried to end things David couldn't let go, and the decision led to a deadly confrontation. Angela Gilpin had separated from her husband Rodney and began a relationship with David Hosier. But as she reconciled with Rodney, David spiraled. According to court records, Angela feared for her life, filing for a restraining order and telling friends she was scared of him. On September 28, 2009, both Angela and Rodney were gunned down in their apartment. Investigators discovered 9mm shell casings and threatening voicemails from Hosier. He fled to Oklahoma, carrying 15 firearms in his vehicle. He was captured after a police chase, and later, the 9mm gun found in his car was linked to the crime scene.
Police say it was Hosier, her neighbor, waiting for her as she left her apartment for work. Hosier would have known when Angie normally left. The two had reportedly had a relationship while Angie was estranged from her husband.
15 years of silence, broken only by legal filings, appeals, and one final clemency plea. Could mental health and a tragic past justify sparing a life? Hosier's defense argued that a traumatic childhood, particularly the violent death of his father, a police officer, led to lifelong psychological damage. Diagnosed with depression and bipolar disorder, his legal team submitted a 19-page clemency petition. Friends and family spoke out, pleading for mercy, emphasizing his untreated grief and emotional decline. But none of it was enough.
My dad was killed. It seemed like my brother just did a big U-turn out of life. He was very quiet, very solemn. No support to cope with what life kept throwing his way. And I really feel like he has some kind of underlying emotional factor.
Time was running out, and the state was preparing for its second execution of the year. Would the system offer humane treatment or another lesson in brutality? As the date approached, legal teams fought not just for clemency, but for procedural safeguards, worried about David's health and the possibility of a painful injection due to his physical condition. June 11th, 2024, the final day. One final meal, one final prayer, one final breath. David Hosier was served his last meal at 11 a.m. A New York strip steak, baked potato, Dutch apple pie, and a glass of milk. In his final statement, he declared, "I leave you all with love. Don't cry for me. Just join me when your time comes." At 6:11 p.m., the execution was carried out. The governor of Missouri had denied clemency, stating Hosier showed no remorse for his senseless violence. Angela and Rodney's families had waited 15 years for that moment. On the day of his execution, his final meal, David Hosier maintained his innocence up to his death. But the execution didn't bring universal closure. Instead, it left behind deeper questions about trauma, justice, and mental health. Supporters of capital punishment viewed Hosier's death as justice served, but critics called it a failure of compassion and mental health awareness, citing his untreated trauma, long-term depression, and system-level abandonment after his father's murder. For some, it was a reckoning. For others, just another man the state put to death.
I have believed in our country. I still do. I believe in our justice system, but somewhere in this world, David has really been failed. Worse than most people.
A death witnessed in silence, but marked by powerful final moments. One last breath, one final word, a mispronounced name. Attorney Jeremy Weiss said David's eyes remained closed as he passed. His final spoken words were, "Give them hell." Reverend Jeff Hood, his spiritual advisor, held his shoulder in the final moments. The moment death was declared, David's name was mispronounced, an act his lawyer called disrespectful to the end. Some believe justice was served. Others see a broken man failed by the systems meant to help him. What's undeniable is the tragedy on all sides, of lives lost, of pain unhealed, and of a man who, even at the end, insisted he was not the one who pulled the trigger. It started with a shocking confession. A young man in custody for one crime, suddenly revealing he knew the location of a missing girl's body. That moment would define the next 2 decades of his life. This is the haunting journey of Ramiro Gonzales, a man whose voluntary words led him to death row, a case that ignited debates over justice, redemption, and the value of human transformation.
In the year 2002, when Gonzales was 19 years old, he was found guilty of kidnapping and rape of a real estate agent near San Antonio.
Gonzales, 41, was convicted and sentenced to death in 2006 for the sexual assault and killing of 18-year-old Bridget Townsend.
The crime was brutal and confessed willingly. After being jailed for another assault, Gonzales approached officers and said he could lead them to a body. He didn't just confess to knowing where Bridget Townsend was buried. He walked deputies through the Texas brush to her remains. But what followed was a trail of conflicting stories. Gonzales changed his account multiple times before finally stating that he acted alone. He admitted to kidnapping Bridget, sexually assaulting her, and ultimately taking her life with a deer rifle just to eliminate a witness. The confession was clear, detailed, and damning. It sealed his fate. He untied Townsend and walked her toward the brushy hillside. As he was loading the rifle, she cried and pleaded. He pretended to let her live, but after sex, he reloaded and shot her. But Gonzales's story didn't end at sentencing. Over nearly 2 decades on death row, he transformed. He found religion, mentored others, and became a leader in a prison faith-based program. Psychiatrists who once labeled him a danger later reversed their opinion. Advocates gathered over 20,000 signatures calling for clemency. And yet, the legal system stood firm. For some, it was too late for redemption. For others, Gonzales became the embodiment of it.
I want to be instrumental in the lives of people, so I search for ways to do so.
As the scheduled execution approached, pressure mounted, the final appeals were denied. The clemency petition was rejected 7-0. Texas prepared to carry out the ultimate sentence. The countdown began. On June 26, 2024, Ramiro Gonzales was led to the execution chamber in Huntsville, Texas. His final meal? Declined. His last words? A prayer. He expressed sorrow for his actions and gratitude to those who stood by him. Officials stood by the sentence, stating it brought closure. The family of Bridget Townsend, though silent, was present, as justice, by the state's definition, was served.
The state of Texas executed an inmate by lethal injection for the murder of an 18-year-old Medina County woman.
Gonzales's death reignited debates nationwide. Was the system just? Was there space for rehabilitation on death row? Supporters mourned the loss of a man they believed had truly changed. Critics emphasized the gravity of his crimes. But above all, questions echoed across Texas and beyond. Can redemption exist within a system built on finality? Outside the death house in Huntsville, reporters and witnesses stood quietly. Among them, Linda Snyder, an advocate and former friend, watched in grief. "Everyone's sad," she said. Protesters held signs. European journalists observed, reflecting global opposition. And as the witnesses crossed the street, it was clear this wasn't just an ending. It was the final chapter of a story filled with pain, change, and complexity.
It's sad. Everybody's sad. There seems like there's a lot of mix-up tonight, even though they put some posters up of the victim out here.
In a justice system that rarely bends, Ramiro Gonzales' case reminds us of the layers behind every crime. A broken boy became a killer. A killer became a man seeking redemption. Whether justice was truly served depends on who you ask. But one thing is certain, this story will not be forgotten. The case of Richard Rogem Jr. is a chilling tale of a heinous crime, a long-delayed justice, and the ultimate price paid. It involves the brutal murder of a young girl, a legal battle spanning decades, and a community's demand for retribution.
Richard Rogem Jr. is the next inmate on death row scheduled for execution, set for June 27th.
Oklahoma executed a real-life monster, Richard Norman Rogem Jr., for the heinous acts against his 7-year-old ex-stepdaughter, Layla Cummings.
In July 1984, 7-year-old Layla Cummings was kidnapped, raped, and murdered. The crime sent shockwaves through the community, and the investigation quickly focused on Richard Rogem Jr., Layla's former stepfather. The evidence against him was compelling and included a condom wrapper found at the crime scene, matching those in his possession, and his fingerprints on a beer cup found outside the victim's residence.
Now, back on July 7th, 1984, Rogem kidnapped, raped, and stabbed Layla Dawn Cummings to death.
Rogem was convicted and sentenced to death. However, his execution was delayed for nearly 4 decades due to successful legal challenges. He was resentenced multiple times, prolonging the suffering of the victim's family and testing the state's justice system.
Rogem was the longest-serving death row inmate in the state history. He also was one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the United States. His execution was delayed for decades, largely because he twice successfully challenged his punishment.
As the final execution date approached, Rogem maintained his innocence. His defense team made last-ditch efforts, including seeking clemency, arguing that he did not receive a fair trial. On July 27, 2024, Richard Rogem Jr. was executed by lethal injection. His last meal consisted of 2 small double cheese, double pepperoni pizzas from Little Caesars and 2 cups of vanilla ice cream. His final words were brief.
Richard Norman Rogem Jr. had nothing to say. There was no declaration of innocence, there were no expressions of remorse or regret, and on the execution gurney, he mumbled he had no final words. He said, "I've said my goodbyes."
Following the execution, Layla Cummings' mother expressed relief, stating that justice had been served. The execution brought a sense of closure to the community, but it also reignited the debate about capital punishment. Those present at the execution described a scene marked by the somber finality of the process.
Rojam's execution, though, was the latest to be carried out without any visible complications.
The execution of Richard Rojam Jr. closed a dark chapter in Oklahoma's history. While justice was ultimately served for Layla Cummings, the case serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of violent crime and the enduring impact it has on victims, families, and communities.